Chapter 8, Managing Decision Making. The learning objectives for this chapter include an understanding of what decision making is all about, the types of decisions that are made within an organization, and conditions under which these decisions are made. Also, we'll be looking at the rational perspectives on decision making and the steps in rational decision making. We'll be looking at the behavioral aspects of decision making as well as group and team decision making and the advantages and disadvantages of group and team decision making and how that can be effectively managed. Decision making basically is the act of choosing one alternative from among a set of alternatives, right? And what would you consider a set of alternatives? How do you, as a manager, how do managers arrive at a set of alternatives? It depends on how much information is available to the manager, right? How much the manager is exposed to availability of information, how accessible information is also informs on the set of alternatives that are available to a decision maker. The motivations that are driving the decision too would inform on what the set of alternatives are, right? And the preferences of the decision maker has, right? So, what's the decision making process all about? Is about recognizing, excuse me, and defining the nature of a decision situation. What are the variables affecting that situation? What exactly are the motivations for that decision making situation? Then you can identify what the alternatives are and choose what the best alternative is given what the situation is and what information you have available to you out of the available information, right? And putting that into practice. Now, the word best implies in this situation as effectiveness, right? How effective is the decision? How well is the decision applicable to the situation at hand, right? Whatever alternative that is chosen, how applicable is it? Is it the most applicable to the situation or to the decision making situation at hand? Right. So effective decision making requires that the decision maker understands the situation that is actually driving that decision. Types of decisions. Decisions that are made within organizations usually fall under two categories, right? And the first would be the programmed decision, which is the decision that is structured and occurs or reoccurs with some sort of frequency, right? And an example would be starting your car in the morning. So that happens frequently because for every time you have to leave your house, you have to get into the car to drive out of the house. That means you have to start your car. So a decision to turn on the engine or to start the engine of your car is a programmed decision because it occurs some kind of frequently, right? For as much as you want to leave the house in a vehicle, you would have to start your car in the morning, right? An example of a school related programmed decision like in Francis Marion University, which affects students, would be the course offerings, right? So those course offerings happen at certain periods of time. Like sometimes you find out that there are certain classes that are offered in the fall and some offered in the spring or some offered in the spring and the fall. So at whatever time intervals that occurs tells you at what frequency they get to recur, and that tells you if it's structured in a certain way which you can always make inferences or come to conclusions on what the situation would be, right? So enrollment limits too are kind of structured decisions, right? Because you find out that there are a number of seats that are usually made available. That usually is some kind of structure. And the exam schedules coming with basic dates, right? In a period, dates and conforming to class times, that has some form of structure to it, right? You find out that these sort of decisions are set using programmed decision rules. Now, looking at the non-programmed decisions, these would be decisions that have some form of no, they're unstructured, right, and they occur much less often than the program decision. So the program decision, you find out that the intervals at which they recur is kind of frequent. The intervals are kind of more frequent than the non-program decision. And an example of the non-program decision would be the choice of a vacation destination, right? Because it's not every time of the year that people get to go on vacations, and you find out that for those times that are not frequent within the year, when people have to go on vacation, they most likely have to maybe go to what they call a bucket list to try and come up with where they would choose to go on for their vacation. That would be a non-programmed decision. The diagram on this slide basically illustrates the conditions under which organizational decisions are made. So you find out that organizational decisions are either made under a situation of or a condition of certainty, under a risk condition, or under an uncertainty condition. And the basis of these conditions are basically inferring on the levels of ambiguity, you understand, the levels of non-clarity in the situation or in the conditions for which a decision has to be made, right? And you find out that the acronym VUCA basically affects organizational decision making. It actually impacts on what level of ambiguity the condition would be for decisions to be made in organizations. And like we talked about earlier on, the VUCA stands for volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity, right? So you find out that under conditions of certainty, it is very, very unlikely most times that organizations make decisions under conditions of certainty where there are low levels of ambiguity. It is quite unusual for that to happen, right? And for instance, why that is the case is, for instance, looking at an organization's external environment, let's look at an organization's external task environment, which we know that the task component of the external environment basically includes like the suppliers, the consumers, the regulators, the competitors, right? So for instance, why organizations can't really make decisions under conditions of certainty is organizations wouldn't know for certainty what their competitors in the task environment will do, right? Or what new technology, which is a component of the general external environment, what new technology will be developed that would upend the organizational operations. They can't really make decisions for certain how that would turn out to be, right? So these are things that would basically bear in mind. Most often than not, organizations make decisions under conditions of risk and under conditions of uncertainty. Decision making conditions, decision making under certainty. This is a condition where the decision maker actually knows with some level of certainty that the alternatives that have been chosen are kind of to a large extent exhaustive, right? So the information available or the information they are exposed to is considerate of the information that is available out there, and they understand to what extent those set of alternatives, how to what extent they can impact or influence an outcome, right? So you find out that to some extent they know that for each choice of an alternative from the set of alternatives, this is the likely outcome in the organization that having to decide on adopting such an alternative would be, right? So like we said earlier on also, you find out that few organizational decisions are made under conditions of true certainty. So you see, even policies that are within organizations' purview or within organizations' capabilities to actually manage, let's say the organizational policies, right, which is a part of what is contained in their internal environment, you find out that those policies are equally subject to change or modification during implementation in the event of external or internal influences, thus the low levels of ambiguity that could surround policy guided decision making, right? So there are low levels of decision making, yes, when there are policies, but even those policies, there would be some certain levels of ambiguity as well, because they are subject to changes, given even changes in the external environment. Those could impact internal changes. For instance, if internal policies of an organization would definitely be in consonance with whatever laws in their vicinity, whatever laws in their environment that relate to that particular policy. And in the event those laws or regulations which fall under the legal or political, depending on how you look at it, the political legal component of the general external environment, to the extent that those laws or regulations change, that means that invariably the internal organizational policies that relate to those laws would have to change. So you find out that nothing is really static or certain most times within organizations. Decision making under risk. Under a state of risk, you find out that this is a condition whereby the the extent to which whatever alternatives that could suffice in such or that could come handy for such decisions to be made, the availability of those alternatives, or to the extent that those alternatives, to the extent of outcomes that can stem from each of those alternatives, and the associated costs are determined on probability basis. It's not for sure if the alternatives for decisions to be made would be available. It's based on probability, and to the extent those alternatives, each of them, to the extent they have varied or differential effects on an outcome, to what extent each of them affects an outcome, it's not clear how what the outcomes would be for each alternative. Those are probabilities. What the outcomes would be are based on probabilities as well. And whatever associated costs, be it resources, organizational resources that may be allocated in implementation of the decisions for each of those set of alternatives, those costs are not clear enough what they are. Those are probabilities as well. That would be decision making under risk, right? And you find out that decision making under conditions of risk is accompanied by moderate ambiguity. It's not a low level ambiguity like condition of certainty. It's moderate ambiguity, meaning that there is a moderate level of non-clarity of what the alternatives would be like, how available they are, or to what extent they can affect an outcome, and the associated costs for having to implement any choice of alternative, right? And you find out that that moderate level of ambiguity, to some extent, let's relate that to a financial statement or when financial forecasting is being done. Given that financial forecasting is done based on previous performance, right, over the years, you find out that it's not a clear case of uncertainty, because you can actually base the performance on performance that has been previously attained by the organization. But given that there is a VUCA world out there, meaning that all the variables may not remain the same, right? Given the volatility, uncertainty, ambiguity in the environment, right? Or complexity of the environment, is not for sure that based on previous performances that organizations can actually make the same level of outcomes. For instance, during the COVID-19 period, whatever forecast organization made based off their organizational performance in the years of 2019 and prior, they would be making, it would be conditions of risk. It is it's not condition of risk, but a condition of moderate ambiguity, because it is not for sure how well they would perform in relation to those previous years, right? And you find out that whenever it's a condition of risk, what a decision maker should basically be considerate of is evaluating what the risks are for that decision that has to be made. So they have to get to ask the question, what are the risks? Decision making under uncertainty. Under this condition, the decision maker doesn't know all the sets of alternatives, right? They have what you call bounded rationality. They can only make decisions based off what limited information they are exposed to. They don't have the length and breadth of information, right, for them to make adequate or very conclusive decisions that they are sure of what the outcomes would be for the organization, right? The risk associated with the alternatives that they might even adopt, they don't understand what risks are associated with each alternative that is even available, right? And to what extent these alternatives would influence an outcome, they are unaware of it entirely, right? It's a total uncertain situation. And to make effective decisions in these circumstances, what managers or decision makers have to do is to acquire as much more relevant information, meaning that in as much as they may be having bounded rationality, limited information, they will try and broaden their horizon, try and make more consultations, right? Try and gain more information with regards to what decision that has to be made, right? And approach the situation from a logical and rational perspective. So basically, they try to seek what is the available knowledge out there that can impact that decision so it can actually help them make more informed decision, right? And they should also check the basis for their decisions under that situation of uncertainty vis-a-vis the motivation for making those decisions, right? That would determine to what extent they would be ready to go to undertake certain to actually make certain decisions in the face of uncertainty, right? The motivation behind that decision making would impact the extent to which they make those decisions, and also their capabilities for having to adjust to changing situations, right? Because in a state of uncertainty, they are unsure what the environmental changes would be like. So their capabilities for adaptation in whatever changes that may occur or during whatever changes that may occur in the environment would also impact how much they would be inclined towards making decisions under a condition of uncertainty. And when I say capabilities, what are their risk-taking capabilities, like for the manager or for the decision maker? How risk inclined are they, right? How innovative are they? Meaning that in changing situations in the environment, how flexible are they to adapt and come up with new initiatives towards ensuring sustainability or towards ensuring organizational performance, as well as how proactive are they in decisions or in going forward with initiatives or coming up with initiatives that will make them competitive or successful as an organization. There are two models of decision making. The first being the classical model of decision making. And this model basically emphasizes an approach to decision making whereby the manager makes decisions that they believe are in the best interest of their organization, right? So this model, why it assumes that whatever decisions the manager makes or the decision maker makes is in the best interest of the organization is because they believe these decision makers have the complete information, right? In most cases, having the complete information would be that these decision makers have prior knowledge of the situation or have experience in such decision conditions or decision making conditions, right? And also, or that they've been exposed to such decision making situations. Also, it assumes that those decision makers have been able to eliminate uncertainty, right? And how would they have eliminated uncertainty given that there's always bound to be uncertainty? So there is no condition whereby uncertainty is totally erased. So how would they eliminate that? One way would be that the decision makers or the organization possesses some form of capability called dynamic capabilities that helps them adjust to market or environmental or institutional changes or predicaments which occur in example in developing markets, because these changes are more rapid, or the rate of change is more in developing markets than in advanced economies, if that makes sense. Also, the model assumes that the decision maker is able to evaluate all the aspects regarding the decision making situation, both logically and rationally. And when you talk about all the aspects, you're looking at both the motivation behind the decision, what conditions the decision are make, every aspect relating to the decision, that there's been some form of logical and rational evaluation. So this diagram on this slide basically illustrates the classical decision making, right? It puts it a figure to it, or rather illustrates it, right? It says the first step being when faced with a decision situation, the manager does what to ensure that it aligns with the classical model of decision making, that they obtain complete and perfect information, right? Because they have the length and breadth of information. That's what the model assumes, that they're able to eliminate uncertainty, and that they evaluate whatever alternative they are available, or whatever information available towards the decision making, that they're able to evaluate it both rationally and logically, right? For them to end up with a decision that is in the best interest of the organization, because the classical model is of the assumption that whatever decisions that are made by the manager or the decision maker is ultimately in the best interest of the organization. Steps in rational decision making. The diagram on this slide illustrates the steps for rational decision making, and this helps keep the decision maker focused on facts and logic that help guard against inappropriate assumptions. And you find out that managers must evaluate all alternatives that are available from the set of alternatives required for decision making. They have to evaluate them to ensure that the chances that the alternative chosen is finally successful is there. The chances are higher that they will always lead to successful outcome, right? And for evaluating these alternatives, first and foremost, the first step would be and to evaluate if the alternative is feasible, if it's realistic, if it's achievable, right? If it's something that can work, right? If it's something that can influence an outcome in the first place. And if that is the case, then it transcends or transmits to the next step, which is if the alternative is satisfactory, and further down the line, like we can see, until when it's shown that the alternative has all these attributes, then such alternative is retained for further consideration. Further on the steps in the rational decision making process, we can see the 6 steps enumerated here. We start with recognizing and defining the decision situation. You find out that basically managers are expected to understand what situation is exactly the decision that is being made is done under, right? And that step is all about understanding what problem is at hand that requires to be addressed. That problem at hand defines basically what the decision making situation is, right? So there's the need to define precisely what the problem is, and the manager needs to completely understand the problem, its causes, and its relationship to other factors. Let's assume that the problem in the organization, for instance, is turnover, which is basically the loss of functional or effective staff. Understanding what the effects of turnover are on the organization, or effects of turnover on the performance of the organization, might be a problem situation, or a situation that requires decision to be made, right, to probably stem the turnover. And for turnover, to gain information on what turnover is what is causing the turnover, right? Identifying what alternatives there could be in addressing turnover. You have to understand what exactly is causing for the turnover. And to do that, you probably want to conduct interviews, right? Exit interviews to try and find out what is causing for the turnover and what has to be addressed to stem the turnover. That's why you may want to gather data through exit interviews, right? And you may want to also improve the hiring standards of the organization, because when the recruitment process is kind of very qualitative or is of high quality, right, then it reduces the chances of having turnover, because basically at the recruitment process it's basically ascertained that the candidate that is being employed, whatever their goals are, is in alignment with the goals of the organization, right? So you find out that such would stem the the trend in turnover if it is totally done. So it says hiring standards. Job dissatisfaction does not arise from pay or benefits alone. Career development, lack of career development options could actually cause for turnover as well, right? Or level of employee authority. So what kind of autonomy is granted employees on the job? That could actually cause for turnover, right? So in identifying what the alternatives are for addressing turnover, right? If it's all about remuneration in pay, that is one of the variables. You may want to, as a manager who is to make decisions based on the alternatives, increase pay, right? So this can be cushioned by improving the element of pay for overhead cost in the budget, right? And this and you want to know if that would allow for achievement of financial goals of the organization if overhead cost is improved, right? And if it still is in line with competitive practices in the industry. For instance, increasing pay to ensure that you're not significantly offering higher pay than competitors. You may want to benchmark with competitors, so it's not like you're impeding on the financial performance of your organization by paying so much for your employees, significantly so much, right? And also in selecting the best alternative, right, you want to know which one actually delivers on the best outcomes. Still on the steps in rational decision making. For a manager or a decision maker to implement the alternative that is considered the best alternative, they must also plan for resistance from the employees due to insecurity, inconvenience, and fear of the unknown, because employees may want to continue with what they used to, right? So managers must consider people's resistance, right? They must consider the adoption of change management processes to ensure a smooth transition from what is to what they want to actually establish, right? So managers must also recognize that even when alternatives have been evaluated as precisely as possible and the consequences of these alternatives have been weighed, unanticipated consequences may still occur, right? So you find out that issues can develop when implementation has begun, right? There may be unforeseen circumstances with regards to alternatives that have been fully evaluated for how effective they will be towards outcome. There may still be unforeseen circumstances. Now, in follow-ups and evaluation of results, it's necessary for an evaluation. There's need for an evaluation of the effectiveness of whatever decision that has been made, the effectiveness of how whatever alternative is impactful of the outcomes. Right? Did the alternative serve its original purpose? So managers should ensure that such alternative that they had selected is definitely impactful of the outcomes, and in the event upon evaluation or upon follow-up they realize that it is not impactful of the outcomes, then corrective measures must be taken. Evidence-based management. This basically relates to the commitment to finding and the utilization of best theory and data that is available in making decisions, right? So rational perspectives on decision making basically have been captured or designed under the concept of evidence-based management, right? So it's basically used to answer the question or question the outcomes of decisions based on strongly held beliefs. For example, whether pay for performance policies will motivate the high performance of an organization. So data should be out there if it's relating to evidence-based management for changes in performance in the organization given the institution of pay for performance policies within the organization, right? So you want to see to what extent an organization that is looking at improving their performance, for instance, how institution of pay for performance programs or policies, how that actually affects the improvement of the organizational outcomes, right? So you find out that evidence-based management is all about the availability of data to support whatever decisions that is being made, right? The availability of data that actually infer on the effectiveness or impactfulness of the outcomes of each or selected alternative or each decision that has been made, right? And talk about gathering data that helps in decision making. For instance, if the decision situation or the problem at hand is turnover, one way organizations or decision makers or managers could actually arrive at the decision with realistic data is by the conduct of exit interviews, because in that process they are able to realize for real what the reasons, or rather the reasons why employees that are exiting the organization are exiting, right? So that way, whatever decisions that are being made or whatever alternatives that are being implemented to address turnover, you're basically coming up with such decisions based off data that was gathered from the exit interview. So it is evidence based, right? For whatever change management that is being effected or is being planned to be implemented is based off evidence or data that has been collected from maybe the exit interview process. The 5 principles of evidence-based management, and the first will be to face the hard facts and build a culture in which people are encouraged to tell the truth, even where such truths may be unpleasant to the employers, right, or to their managers. And one way that was basically implemented where I used to work in the industry was the provision of anonymous suggestion boxes, right? So that way it encouraged employees to come forward with what they feel are the hard truths, right, or the hard facts, without actually exposing them or making them feel unwilling to say so or to provide such information because of victimization, right? They would easily be open to providing such information to managers or employers if they're anonymous. That was one way we actually encourage such principle, or we actually instituted such principle for evidence-based management where I used to work in the industry. The second principle would be to be committed to fact-based decision makers. So in as much as the hard truths are presented, actually relying or actually basing the decisions that are being made on those hard facts is one of those principles, which means being committed to getting the best evidence and using it to guide the managers or decision makers' actions. Further on the principles of evidence-based management, right? The third principle would be to treat one's organization as an unfinished prototype, right? Encouraging experimentation and learning by doing. So by treating one's organization as an unfinished prototype is basically taking cognizance of the fact that nothing is static. The environment in which organizations operate is a dynamic environment, a volatile environment, and that organizations need to evolve by benchmarking, even where there may be no urgency from within, right? So it's all about even where there is nothing broken, for them to fix it, they may want to test the trust of their system, the effectiveness of their system, by basically shocking the system, right? Trying to see, in the event of changes in the environment, by trying to simulate changes in the environment in order to see how trusted their systems are, or how effective their systems are to adapting to those changes, right? So organizations could actually shock their systems in a way that their systems aren't fully established, so that they could see where there are areas of improvement. So such shocks will provide evidence and basis for them improving what is, or what the status quo is. The fourth principle would be to look for the risks and drawbacks in what people recommend. So in consultations or in gathering of data, it will be also necessary to evaluate for those risks and shortcomings in those recommended approaches, or recommended data, or recommended information that is available. And the fifth principle would be to avoid basing decisions on untested but strongly held beliefs, what you have done in the past, or on critical benchmarking of what winners do. So it means that for an organization to adopt what has been successful in another organization following a benchmark, right? So organizations basically benchmark to see what practices that are not existent in their organization but probably existing in another organization, that makes for that other organization to be successful, or to have successful outcomes. So when an organization adopts such strategy or adopts such initiatives without actually verifying for other variables in that other organization that is successful, that may have warranted for the success of that strategy, then it's possible that when such strategy is implemented, it may not be successful, and that will be uncritical benchmarking, meaning that there was no consideration for differences in the environments or elements of the environment in two different organizations that may allow for the effectiveness of one decision that has been made versus such effective, or how effective such decisions will be in another organization. So it's good to fact check, or basically do some critique of whatever it is, are initiatives that stem from a benchmarking process. The administrative model for decision making, which is like the flip side, not entirely a flip side, but may be considered a flip side of the classical model of decision making. And this model basically argues that the decision makers or managers, for starters, use incomplete and imperfect information, meaning that the information required or available to such decision makers or managers for a decision to be made are definitely not exhaustive, right? And also, the managers or decision makers are constrained by what is called the bounded rationality, and that they tend to satisfy when making decisions. Now, bounded rationality is a concept that indicates that decision makers are limited by their values and unconscious reflexes, skills, and habits. So, these unconscious reflexes, rather, skills and habits, basically are, or rather, are founded on how much knowledge or experience or exposure the decision maker or manager has been availed, right? Or how much exposure, or how much they've been exposed to, right? So basically, that is an explanation of boundary rationality. So as much as the information managers have at their wherewithal, as much as the experience that they have, as much as the knowledge that they have, to that extent is how effective whatever decisions they can come up with is, meaning that they may not have inexhaustive or incomplete information, would definitely lead to subpar outcomes because they do not have the length and breadth of the information required for decision making. Now, satisficing is the tendency to search for alternatives until one is found that meets the minimum standard of sufficiency, right? So, for instance, decision maker satisfies when they do not conduct an exhaustive search for the best possible alternative. An example of that would be, for instance, if for instance the School of Business is trying to fill a vacancy for faculty member, right? And there are the basic requirements for filling up that position. So, assuming that the search committee basically decides on or basically hires the first candidate that meets those requirements for filling the position, that would be satisfying. But having to invite all the candidates that meet the basic requirements and evaluate those candidates based off their performance in as much as they possess those basic requirements to see who is the best fit for the organization in such a decision that which is to fill a vacancy is being made, right? The decision situation is fill a vacancy. So having to evaluate all applicants that meet the requirement to see who is the best fit for the organization would be not to satisfy us, right? That would be a rational decision that is made because all the alternatives have been considered logically and rationally by comparing them amongst themselves, right? But satisfying is when the first candidate or applicant that meets the requirement is hired by the organization. So both the classical and administrative models provide an understanding on how managers actually make decisions within organizations, right? As much as the classical model highlights that managers at least make more rational and logical decisions, right? Or they have a more rational and logical approach towards their decision making. The administrative model, on the other hand, says that managers have inherent biases and limitations. They highlight those biases and limitations of managers, right, that actually prompt for them to have bounded rationality and also prompt for them to satisfy. So this diagram on this slide basically is an illustration of the administrative model, what the process is like, right, for decision making. The administrative model, when it's adopted by a decision maker or a manager towards making a decision. So you find out that when they are faced with such decision situation, the managers use incomplete and imperfect information, right, because they have bounded rationality, they have limited exposure, right? So, and they are constrained by, so based on this incomplete and imperfect information, you find out that they are constrained by bounded rationality. And satisfying would be that they don't have, for instance, in hiring a candidate, they don't have the complete information of all the candidates that are eligible, so they just go with the first candidate. That will be satisfying. So basing their decision off incomplete and imperfect information, and you find out that will make them end up with a decision that may be in the best interest of the organization or may not likely be in the best interest of the organization. Political forces in decision making. A coalition. This is an informal alliance of individuals or groups formed to achieve a common goal. And you find out that coalitions even happen within organizations, right? Now, the common goal of a coalition is often to arrive at a preferred decision, all right, or having a preferred alternative being implemented. That's the whole idea of a coalition. So the group or the coalition or the alliance of individuals basically are there to spearhead or propagate what is of preference to the group, right, as the choice alternative. And the impact of coalitions can either be positive or negative because the interest of the group or interest of the alliance may not be in the best interest of the organization, right, that has this coalition. And managers must recognize when to use coalitions, how to assess whether these coalitions are in the best interest of the organization, and how to actually manage for their dysfunctional effects, right? How to limit the dysfunctions or the limitations of, or rather to limit the impact, the negative impact of coalitions, right? So you find out that coalitions play an important role in decision making because these coalitions or alliances could be in form of inter or intradepartmental committees within an organization or across organizations as the case may be. Intuition and escalation of commitment. Intuition is an innate belief about something without conscious consideration. You find out that some decisions too are made based on intuition, right? Intuition and escalation of commitment are processes that basically go beyond the logic or rationality of the decisions, right? You find out that managers sometimes decide to do something because it feels right or they have a hunch. That would be intuition. And you find out that such feelings or such hunches are not arbitrary, but based on the years of experience of these managers and their practice in making similar decisions or making decisions in similar situations, right? So, though managers may sometimes seem to make decisions based on intuition, in reality, they are also relying on their experience, judgment, and other resources, even if they are doing so unconsciously. Now, escalation of commitment is when a decision maker or manager maintains their position or maintains or sticks to their decision even when such a decision appears to be wrong, right? So what are we saying? It's saying that at the process of evaluating the choice or alternative, right, after implementation, if it is obvious or if it is seen that such decision is it impactful of positive outcomes, right, or such decision isn't actually addressing the problem at hand within that decision making situation, then such alternative should either be expunged or modified in so that it serves the interest of the organization, right? But escalation of commitment is when the manager who is implementing that decision or the decision maker who is implementing that choice or alternative notices that it is not impactful of positive outcomes but chooses to stick with that decision that is being made. It may be based off pride, right? Because such a decision maker or a manager may feel that they may be accused of making wrong decisions, so they may want to stick with that wrong decision rather than have it corrected, right? Taking corrective actions would be doing away with such decision or modifying it accordingly, right? So, but when those managers rather or decision makers stick to such wrong decisions for whatever reasons, that would be escalation of commitment. Risk propensity and decision making. Risk propensity basically is the extent to which decision makers or managers are willing to gamble when making a decision, right? Managers who are willing to take risks are more likely than their conservative counterparts to achieve big successes with their decisions. They are also more likely to incur greater losses. So, in a risky situation, right, or in a situation where decisions that are being made are made under conditions of risk, right? That means that in the event that those risks are have positive outcomes, then the managers or the decision makers that engaged in such risky decisions would have better outcomes than the managers who chose to be risk averse, right? Who were basically cutting down on the amount of risks they are taking that may hurt or may actually be valuable to the organization. So it goes both ways. It's not really entirely 50-50, but it's a probability estimate that risky situations could actually lead to positive outcomes for the organization, in which case those managers that are risk inclined achieve better outcomes, or that risky situations could actually deter the performance of an organization by harming the organizational outcomes, right? And in such situations, those risk averse managers are the ones that have provided for better outcomes for the organization because they chose not to engage in risks, right? So you find out also that, let's say the decision makers are the board members, you find out that younger managers that are part of the board of directors, when it's a decision made at the top level of the organization, right, younger managers are more inclined to taking risks than their older counterparts. It's something you may want to note. Ethics and decision making. Every component of managerial ethics, right? And we understand that the components of managerial ethics are three of them. One will be the obligation of the firm or the organization to its employees in their employer-employee relationship. The second will be obligations of the employee to the firm in the employer-employee relationship. And the third will be obligations of both the employer and the employee to economic agents of the organization, right? So you find out that for each of these areas of managerial ethics, it involves a wide variety of decisions, all of which are likely to have an ethical component, right? In all these relationships, be it in the obligatory relationship of an employer and the obligation of an employer in its employer-employee relationship, or in an employee's obligation in the employer-employee relationship, or in the employer-employee's relationship with external economic agents, you find out that in such decisions, besides the role politics plays in decision making, the role risk propensity plays in decision making, ethics also of whoever the decision maker is in that situation also plays a role in decisions that are being made. So you find out that personal ethical standards will shape how we respond and proceed with our decision making processes if we're the decision makers or managers, right? Those decisions are influenced by the decision maker's personal ethics or their own beliefs about what is considered right and wrong. Forms of group and team decision making. We have three of this group and team decision making we'll be discussing, and the first will be the interacting group or team. And this is a decision making group or team in which members openly discuss, argue about, and agree on the best alternative. Examples of such an interacting group or team or a decision making group would be when you like a group in class, right, where it's comprised of colleagues or students that are in the same class, right? For them to arrive at a decision or a group decision, those members are expected to make input towards the decision, to contribute their knowledge bases, right? So in the event that such an interactive group or team is present in the working environment as well, you find out that the constitution of that group is based on the expertise that each member that is part of the group brings to bear in the group for decisions to be made. So every member of the group kind of contributes their knowledge or makes inputs in line with their expertise so that the group comes up with a decision that is considered the best alternative, right? So you also have what you call the Delphi group, right? It's a form of group decision making in which a group arrives at a consensus of expert opinion, right? So this Delphi procedure is basically based on a solicitation of input from a panel of experts who contribute individual or their individual expertise towards the group outcomes, and their opinions are combined and averaged. These results, or rather the average of their opinions, are fed back to the experts, and this process continues until a solution is reached. So that's the process for group decision making when it's the Delphi group decision making. And you have what you call the nominal group, which is a structured technique used to generate creative and innovative alternatives or ideas. And for the nominal group, right, this is an informed group of participants whose members individually write down a list of alternatives as much as they can think of, and these ideas are put up on a board in a round robin fashion, right? After the alternatives have been listed, the members of this nominal group openly discuss these alternatives that have been presented on a board, right? And the members vote on the alternatives that have been presented, whereby the highest ranking alternative represents the decision of this group. So the table contained on this slide basically enumerates the advantages and disadvantages of group and team decision making. So you may want to familiarize yourself with the content of this table. So a major disadvantage of group and team decision making, which is what is called the group think. You find out that this group think is a concept whereby it occurs, or is a situation whereby it occurs when a group or team's desire for consensus and cohesiveness overwhelms its desire to reach the best alternative, or to adopt the best alternative, or to actually reach the best possible decision, right? That would be a disadvantage of the group decision making under the groupthink, right? And also, this groupthink means whereby a situation whereby members agree with the decision because it is easier, not necessarily that the decision that is being made is the right or best decision, right? And it basically allows for a group decision that is based off one person's opinion, right? So most of the time, groupthink is usually one member's opinion that is basically propagated by other members of the group as the group's decision. Managing group and team decision making processes, right? So you find out that there are several things that managers have to do to promote the effectiveness of group and team decision making. And one would be to be aware of the pros and cons of having a group or team make a decision. So such awareness would actually guide against group thinking, right? Or guide against what the cons of group decision making are, the disadvantages are. So also in managing group and team decision making processes, deadlines have to be set for those groups or for those teams, right? For decisions to be made, the deadlines, realistic deadlines have to be set, right? So it says setting a deadline by which the decision must be made final. And why deadlines have to be set is to actually manage time and cost. Why I mean time and cost is you find out that most times when groups or teams are constituted within an organization, it's basically constituted by members of different departments within the organization coming together to address a problem, right? And it means that those members of the group actually have their own functional roles. They have their roles in their various departments for which it will be contesting for time with their roles in the group work or in the team decision making that is necessary to be done, right? So you find out that having deadlines or timelines would allow for those group decisions to be made promptly so that members of the group can actually go back to what their roles or their basic functions within the organization are. So deadlines will manage for time, and also it will manage for cost, because you find out that most often than not, when those groups or teams are constituted, there are some form of allowance that is paid to the members of the group called sitting allowance in most organizations. When you have committees or groups that are constituted to address a particular problem or to make decisions, right? There is some form of financial resources that is allocated for the operations of such groups or teams or committees, and it also provides for what you call sitting allowances. So deadlines would help for managing the cost of those sitting allowances, if that makes sense. Now also, another thing that is to be done in managing these decision making processes in groups and teams would be to avoid problems with dominance by managing group membership, right? So dominance can be least partially avoided if a special group or committee is formed just to make the decision. So it means that the decision is not domiciled with only one department of the organization. The decision cuts across departments of organization. So no one department may claim dominance over the decision that has been made, which may be collective for members of the organization, right? So also you may want to have each group member critically evaluate all alternatives. And why that has to be done is to avoid groupthink, right? So to avoid groupthink, group members must critically evaluate all alternatives. There should be allowance for divergent viewpoints, and also one group member should be assigned the role of devil's advocate. And the role of devil's advocate is to basically critique all alternatives that have been presented by the members of the group, to critique them for their effectiveness or impactfulness towards an outcome or towards the addressing of a particular problem in that decision making situation, right? So also another way to manage group and team decision making processes would be to conduct follow-up meetings to actually verify or validate the decisions that have been made.